In the long and sordid history of high-profile Hollywood flops, there are certain movies that stand above and beyond the rest, gigantic and eternal monuments to the hubris and poor decisions of movie makers. Films like Heaven's Gate, Cutthroat Island, and Super Mario Bros. But there's one film that became notorious for its massive overspending, creative meddling, disastrous box office, and of course, its deeply troubled production. And that film is Kevin Costner's epic post-apocalyptic adventure movie, Waterworld. The film became notorious for its massively bloated budget, which started out relatively small, only to spiral out of control until it reached $175 million, well over $300 million in today's money, making it easily one of the most expensive movies ever made. And the reason it became such a costly disaster for the studio is fertile ground for another installment of Production Hell. So grab your snorkel and flippers and let's dive into the murky depths of Waterworld. The film began in the mind of Hollywood screenwriter David Rader way back in 1986. It was a story about a small group of survivors on a waterlogged planet Earth, searching for the last remaining piece of dry land to call home. He imagined it as a kind of low-budget rip-off of Mad Max, only set on the ocean instead of the Australian outback. Anyway, he plugged away at it for a few years without much success. Various producers considered and then rejected it, including Roger Corman, the king of the B-movie, who reckoned that it would be too expensive to make. Damn man, the mind boggles at what Roger Corman's version of Waterworld might have been like. Anyway, things changed in 1992 when actor and director team Kevin Costner and Kevin Reynolds signed on for the film. The pair had had a string of successful productions together, Costner was riding high at the box office, and it seemed like everything was coming together at last. The movie was quickly bumped up from a small-scale indie project to a big-budget Hollywood blockbuster with $100 million set aside for the production. Naturally, the script had to be retooled to cope with such massive changes, but Universal were eager to get things moving, and so the film went straight into production while rewrites were still underway. Not the best start, but things were about to get a whole lot worse. The story called for the construction of massive sets to represent survivor communities eking out a living on the ocean. Reynolds and Costner wanted to keep it as realistic as possible and planned to shoot most of these sets out on the open water just off Hawaii, despite Steven Spielberg personally warning them not to do it. He tried the same thing during the infamously difficult shoot for Jaws 20 years earlier and knew what a nightmare it could be. His warnings were duly ignored, and the elaborate, expensive and delicate sets were constructed in the middle of the ocean during hurricane season. Guess what happened next? That's right, a hurricane blew up and destroyed the set, forcing it to be rebuilt at enormous cost. Oh my goodness, who could have predicted something like this? Even when the sets weren't getting destroyed by hurricanes, the weather was generally so shit that it was difficult to get anything shot. High winds caused the cameras to move around and blew the film crew out of position, forcing multiple retakes and slowing down production drastically. There were no toilets available on set, for obvious reasons, so anyone who needed to take a dump had to make a lengthy trip back to shore. It was also a dangerous movie to be in. While trying to film a scene aboard a boat in rough weather, the entire bowsprit snapped off and the actresses playing Helen and Enola were thrown into the water, forcing them to swim for their lives until a rescue crew could get to them. A safety diver tried to surface too quickly and got struck down with decompression sickness, forcing him to be rushed to intensive care. Unknown to the production team, Kevin Costner's stunt double would ride out from his beachfront home across 40 miles of open water to the set each day on his jet ski, which is a fucking Chad move if ever I've heard one, until one day when he forgot to refuel it and ran out of gas halfway there. Of course, nobody knew where he was because he hadn't told anyone what he was up to.
Not a great plan.
And it wasn't until the film crew called his wife that she explained what had actually happened. By the time they eventually found him, he'd been drifting on the ocean currents for hours. Even Costner himself wasn't immune to the bad luck on set. One scene required him to be tied to the mast of his boat until another storm came up and blew him out to sea before anyone could untie him. I like to imagine that he had quite a bit of time to think about his life while he was waiting to get rescued, and probably his biggest thought was, what the fuck have I gotten myself into here? All of these various issues caused the shooting schedule to gradually fall apart. Principal photography was supposed to be wrapped after 90 days, but the constant problems, accidents and delays eventually pushed it to well over 150 days. Needless to say, morale wasn't looking good, but if the cast and crew were unhappy, then things were even worse between the Kevins. The two men had managed to produce a string of successful movies together over the past few years, but they were never what you'd call best buddies. In fact, they clashed repeatedly on the set of Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, to the point where Reynolds was reluctant to work with Costner again on Waterworld and actually suggested going with a completely different actor. The studio were adamant though, Costner it had to be. But if things between them were bad before, then they were at breaking point with this film. Costner was in the middle of a difficult and expensive divorce, which didn't do much to improve his mood. His $14 million paycheck, coupled with his insistence on staying at a luxury beachfront villa and commuting to the set each day on his own personal yacht, was quickly adding to the already ballooning budget. And when Reynolds screened a rough cut of the film for the studio, Costner rejected it out of hand and demanded extensive rewrites and reshoots. The in-depth world building and character development was ditched in favour of big blowout action sequences. The Mariner character was rewritten from a dark, morally ambiguous anti-hero to a much more conventional heroic protagonist, and the runtime was slashed from 170 to 135 minutes. Shit man, even a young Joss Whedon was brought in to try to salvage the script, before rightly concluding that it was a complete fucking mess, and nothing short of a full rewrite would fix it. Eventually it all became too much for Reynolds, who decided, fuck it, you can do whatever you want because I'm out of here, and promptly left the production. But finally, after 156 days of grueling shooting, Waterworld limped across the finish line with a final budget of $175 million, making it by far the most expensive movie ever produced at the time. And for comparison, Jurassic Park cost just $63 million to make, and Independence Day cost $75 million. And what made things even worse is that the media got hold of the story and wouldn't let go. In the months leading up to the film's release, all anyone was really talking about was how fucking expensive the thing had been. The narrative that was quickly building up around the movie was a massively expensive vanity project from an actor that had gotten too big for his boots, and it all contributed to an atmosphere of negativity that it never quite managed to escape. People were practically chomping at the bit for it to fail, and well, it did, bringing in just $260 million worldwide. Nowhere near enough to cover the massive production budget. The failure of Waterworld and The Postman a couple of years later put Kevin Costner's career on a downward trajectory that would last more than a decade, not to mention ending his friendship with Kevin Reynolds. The two men would never work together again. And it's kind of a shame thinking about it now because, well, Waterworld's not actually a bad movie. In fact, rewatching it for this video, I was struck by just how good it looks even today. Almost all of it was done with practical effects and real sets, and whatever nightmares it must have caused for the production, the result is a weirdly ageless quality to the film. It hasn't become cheesy and dated like so many other effects-heavy 90s sci-fi movies have. The action and the set design still looks amazing, and even in the cut-down theatrical version, you get little hints that there's a much deeper, richer, and well-developed world lurking beneath all of this. By all accounts, the 170-minute director's cut that was released a decade later is a far superior movie that's much closer to the original vision, but obviously it came far too late to change the perception of Waterworld being a massive creative and financial failure. Either way, I think the film's a good example of what happens when overconfident filmmakers, high on money and success, take on something way bigger and more difficult than they bargained for. But hey, it makes for an interesting retrospective, that's for sure. Anyway, that's all I've got for today. Go away now.